They didn't whisper it. They said it right to her face, too fat to be anyone's wife. She ain't a woman, she's a wagon. No man with eyes would want that lump of lard. And the worst part wasn't the words. It was that no one stopped them. Not the mayor, not the preacher, not even the other women. So they dragged Etta Mae onto a saloon stage, slapped a number on her back like a cattle tag, and began the bidding. Not for marriage, not for help, for sport, for a joke, for the crowd's entertainment. Sold to the pig pen, one shouted. Another offered a penny, and that's being generous. She stood still, face like stone, even as her soul crumbled quietly inside. Because when you've been called a burden your whole life, there's a part of you that starts to believe it. But just when the auctioneer raised his gavel, just as the whole room erupted in cruel laughter, he stepped forward. A tall man in dust-worn boots, quiet eyes that had seen enough pain to know it when he saw it again. He didn't shout. He just looked at her, not her size, not her shamer, and then he said, calm and clear, $10, and don't call her that again. The room went silent. All that cruelty suddenly unsure. Why would a man fight for a woman everyone else called worthless? What happens when the world sees you as too much, and someone finally says, you are just enough exactly as you are, stay with us? Because this isn't a rescue story. It's a story about dignity, reclaimed love, offered without requirement, and a woman learning, maybe for the first time, that she was never the problem. Only the mirror was broken. They said she was too old, too big, too quiet, like those were crimes instead of truths. And in a dusty saloon, stinking of sweat and whiskey, Etta Mae Colburn stood under flickering lamplight, her hands clasped over a shawl worn thin at the elbows, as the auctioneer's voice sliced through the noise like a blade dulled by cruelty. Next up, strong arms, wide hips, and knows how to cook. But fair warning, gents, she's not your dainty lil' thing. Laughter, low, mean. A few men spat. A few shouted numbers, not even bothering to look at her face. She didn't flinch. Not because it didn't hurt, but because she'd run out of ways to show pain. Etta Mae was 52. A woman who'd once held a marriage certificate like it meant safety, and watched it turn to ash when her husband ran off with a girl half her age. Since then, she'd scrubbed floors, mended clothes for townsfolk who wouldn't look her in the eye, and slept in barns when the inns turned her away. And now she was on display like livestock because the sheriff said, we don't want vagrants in this town, and the brothel owner said she was too round to bring in coin, so they auctioned her. But in the back of the room near the doorway where the light didn't quite reach, someone was watching, not with amusement, not with pity, but with something steadier, sadder, like he'd seen this before, and never wanted to see it again. Calder Reese was a rancher, quiet, widowed, and never did he imagine that stepping into town for horse feed would end with him staring at a woman being bartered like a mule. She didn't look afraid. That's what broke him. Because fear was human. But this, resignation, this was something deeper. $5, someone shouted. $6 to send her back where she came from. More laughter. Calder stepped forward, took off his hat. $10, he said, voice low, clear. The room quieted. He looked straight at her, and for the first time that night, Etta Mae's chin lifted, just slightly, not because she thought she was saved, but because someone just one had spoken without mocking. What happens when a woman who's been discarded by the world is noticed by a man who sees her as more than enough? The townfolk muttered when Calder Reese handed over $10 and said nothing more. Didn't grab her arm. Didn't tell her you're mine now. Didn't even look proud. He just turned to her, held out the reins of his mule and said softly, you can ride if you'd like, or walk if that feels better. Etta Mae blinked. No one had asked her what felt better in a long, long time. She chose to walk, and so he did too, side by side, in silence, across 5 miles of dry prairie dust where nothing pressed her to speak and no one filled the space with noise. Just the sound of mule hooves, the crunch of grass, and the wind, humming low like an old hymn. His ranch was modest, 2 rooms, a barn, a porch that creaked, but it was clean, lived in, honest. He opened the front door, stepped back. You're welcome to stay the night, he said. Barn's yours if you want quiet, or the couch if it's warmer. She hesitated. The couch in a man's house? He nodded as if hearing her thought. I won't be where you are, not unless you say so. That stopped her, because he just bought her and still spoke to her like she owned herself. She chose the barn, not because she feared him, but because her bones only knew how to rest in solitude. That night he brought her blankets, a clean lamp, a biscuit wrapped in cloth, didn't linger, didn't ask for thanks, just nodded once and left. In the morning, she woke to a pot of hot coffee by the door. No note, just steam curling up like an invitation. When she stepped out, Calder was by the chicken coop, sleeves rolled, feeding grain. He looked up, not surprised. "Morning, Miss Etta." "Miss, not girl, not you, not thing." It rang in her chest like a bell. They didn't speak much over breakfast. She ate slow. He fixed the hinge on the porch door, but when she offered to scrub the pans, he said gently, "Not today. You've done enough scrubbing in your life, I reckon." And in that moment, she felt something stir. Not love, not attraction, but a loosening. A knot inside her chest, tight for decades, finally gave her a little room to breathe. What happens when the first man who touches your life never tries to touch your body? When kindness walks, not grabs. The days passed like a quiet hymn. No one called her a burden. No one watched her eat. No one asked her to earn her keep. Calder offered a room. She chose the barn again. He built a clothesline for her dresses. She used it at night when no one could see them sway. She cooked a stew once, and he said, "That's the best thing I've had since Sarah died." But she didn't ask who Sarah was. She didn't want to know if his heart had already been full once and was now just making room out of politeness. One afternoon, she found a mirror tucked into a box beneath the porch, a small hand mirror, cracked along one corner. She hadn't looked at herself in weeks, months maybe. She stared long and quiet, not because she was hoping to see beauty, but to see if she was still there. She touched her cheeks soft now with time and kindness, and she whispered, "Don't fall for peace. It might just be silence." But peace kept showing up. In the way Calder saved the last slice of cornbread without saying why, in how he left her boots by the fire to warm without ever calling attention to it, in how he sat on the porch each night with a second cup of coffee that he never drank just in case she wanted to join him. And one evening, she did. They didn't speak, they just sat. And when she rose to go inside, he said quietly, "You don't have to earn your place here, Etta. Not with me." She paused, looked at him, then asked the question she hadn't let herself ask in decades. "Why are you being kind to me?" He met her eyes, not soft, not pitying, just steady. "Because I see you." She turned away, afraid her face might crack, because being seen was more dangerous than being ignored. That night she lay awake in the barn, staring at the rafters. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to sit beside him and let her body rest. She wanted to stop holding her breath. But when a woman has spent a lifetime surviving disappointment, even comfort feels like a trick. What happens when your heart starts to hope again, and your mind whispers, "Don't trust it," when kindness feels like the beginning of a debt you'll never repay? The first snow came early, just a whisper of white on the barn roof, the kind that makes the world look clean, even if it isn't. Etta May had stayed nearly 3 weeks now, longer than she'd stayed anywhere in years. She still hadn't unpacked her valise. Still slept in the barn, though Calder had fixed up the guest room with fresh linens and even put a jar of lilacs by the window. But that morning something shifted. She woke up and didn't feel the need to hide her hair under her scarf. She came into the kitchen with her shawl loose, not tied tight like armor, and when she sat across from Calder, he smiled and said, "Morning, Miss Etta." And for once, it didn't feel like a formality. It felt like an invitation to stay. Later that day, she found him sanding the porch railing. She stood watching him for a long time, then asked quietly, "Who was Sarah?" He paused, wiped his hands, looked toward the hills. "My wife," he said. "Gone 5 winters now. Kind soul. Sick heart." Etta nodded. She waited for more, like people usually did, but he didn't offer it. He just said, "You remind me of her, but not because you look like her. You remind me of her because you carry silence with dignity." Etta looked down at her hands. "People don't usually think silence is dignified. They don't know what it costs," Calder said. That night, she moved her things into the guest room, not because he asked, but because she wanted to stop sleeping like she might be gone by morning. And the day after, she did something harder. She sat at the table during supper and said, "When they auctioned me, the thing that hurt most wasn't the laughter. It was that I expected it. I expected to be humiliated, and that felt normal." Calder put down his fork. "You didn't deserve that, I know," she said. "I just forgot for a while." He reached across the table slowly, not touching her hand, just placing his beside hers. "If you ever forget again," he said, "I'll remind you." That night she slept with the door open, not for air, but so the light from the hallway could come in, because now it felt like a home. What happens when you finally start believing someone might stay, and even more frightening, that you might want to stay too? By the time spring came, the wind had changed its tone. It no longer howled through the hills. It hummed soft and steady, like it too had finally found somewhere it wanted to stay. Etta May no longer wore her boots indoors. She had a shelf now by the door. Calder built it one morning without asking, just placed it there with space for 2 pairs and a little vase in the center. She put wildflowers in it. He didn't comment, but the next day it was refilled with fresh ones. Neither of them mentioned it, but both noticed. They shared breakfast most mornings now. She baked. He cleaned up. One day she found him sanding down an old rocking chair. She stood beside him, squinting. "That's Sarah's." He nodded. "You sure she wouldn't mind?" He looked at her steady. "I think she'd like you in it." Etta sat down slowly, expecting the wood to creak, expecting judgment to echo through it. But all she heard was birdsong. So she rocked, and Calder kept sanding, and the silence between them felt warm. Later that evening he asked if she wanted to come to the spring fair. "Just to walk," he said, "not to be seen." She hesitated. The last time she stood in a public square, men had laughed at her like she was meat on a hook, but Calder added gently, "We don't have to go, I just thought you might like cotton candy or music." That's when she said yes. Not because she was ready for the world, but because she was ready to walk beside someone who'd never once asked her to shrink. At the fair, people stared. Some whispered, but no one laughed. Maybe because Calder's presence was solid, quiet, like a tree that didn't bend in storm. He offered her an apple. She took it. He didn't ask her to dance. But when she stood near the music, tapping her foot gently, he smiled. And when someone called out that the woman from the saloon, Calder said calm and plain, "She's the woman from my porch. That's all you need to know." That night back home, she told him, "You didn't have to say anything." He replied, "I didn't say it for them. Sometimes love isn't loud. It's the act of being witnessed and still welcomed." The letter came folded, no return name, but she recognized the handwriting. All thick loops and arrogance. Bernie Cobb, one of the men who jeered loudest at the auction. He hadn't bought her, but he'd tried. He'd called her too soft to survive, then laughed when she didn't flinch. Now he was passing through, said he wanted to talk. Etta showed the note to Calder. He didn't tell her what to do. He just said, "If you want me nearby, I will be." She nodded. "I don't want protection, just presence." Bernie arrived late afternoon on a borrowed mule. He looked thinner than she remembered, older, but the smirk was still there. "Well," he said, stepping off. "You landed on your feet, I see." Etta folded her arms. "I always had feet. You just never saw them." He chuckled. "Didn't expect you to end up with a place like this. Thought maybe you'd be shipped East End up scrubbing floors till your knees gave." "I did scrub floors," she said calmly. "And they shined." He blinked. "You came for something?" she asked. "Maybe to apologize," he said, scratching his beard. "Folks say you're doing all right. Figured maybe you'd thank me for putting fire under you." She almost laughed, but instead she took a breath. "You didn't light a fire, you threw dirt. I grew anyway." Bernie shifted, unsure whether to be proud or offended. Then Calder stepped out onto the porch. Didn't say a word, just stood arms crossed, not threatening, just present. Bernie glanced at him, then at her. "You his wife now?" Etta smiled gently with a kind of peace that had nothing to do with romance. "I'm myself now," then added, "and I'm not for auction. Not anymore." Bernie shrugged. "Suit yourself," and left. Didn't ask for forgiveness, didn't get any. And Etta didn't feel empty because of that. She wasn't looking for closure. She was living in continuation. That evening, Calder made her tea. Didn't ask what was said. She placed her hand on his arm just for a moment. "Thank you for letting me face it on my own." He met her eyes. "I knew you could." She smiled. Not because she'd won, but because she'd stayed standing and didn't need to prove it to anyone. What happens when the past knocks and you realize it has no power unless you open the door? And what if this time you walk away without needing to slam it? Spring passed gently into summer. The days grew long and the porch warm. Etta May started baking more than needed. Calder started drinking his coffee slower, like maybe he was waiting for her to join him. She didn't move back to the barn, but she never quite said she'd stay. Until one evening, just after sundown, Calder walked out onto the porch, and beside his usual rocking chair was another, new, sanded smooth, with a cushion she'd sewn weeks ago folded neatly across it. No grand gesture, no "I love you," no proposal, just a place set aside for her. She stepped outside, cup in hand, looked at him, then the chair. He didn't speak, just patted the armrest softly. "Only if you want," he said. She sat. Not because it was expected, but because it was offered. And for a long moment they rocked in silence. Two people who had once been laughed at, discarded, left behind, now seated side by side, not out of rescue, but recognition. Later, as stars settled into the sky, she said softly, "They once auctioned me like a pig." Calder nodded. "I know." She turned to him. "But you never saw me that way." He shook his head. "I saw someone who still stood tall even when no one asked her to." She looked out toward the hills, then said almost to herself, "I think I'll stay." He didn't smile. He exhaled like he'd been holding that breath for years, and when he placed his hand atop hers, warm, steady, no rush, she didn't pull away. This wasn't a fairy tale, but it was a beginning, not built on promises, built on presence. And when the wind passed over them like a soft hymn, neither one flinched. They simply stayed. Not everyone has stood on an auction block, but most of us have felt judged for our size, for our age, for the quiet parts of ourselves we've been taught to hide. Etta Mae wasn't rescued by a grand gesture. She was seen by a man who didn't turn away, by a porch with 2 chairs, by a voice that said softly, "You don't have to earn your worth. You already have it." That's how healing begins, not with noise, but with presence. With someone staying when the world told you you weren't worth staying for. If you've ever felt forgotten, overlooked, or unchosen, this story was meant for you, because someone out there still sees you. There's still a place for you to sit and stay. In the comments, we'd love to hear from you. Have you ever met someone who made you feel like you were enough just as you are? Would you like more stories like Etta's, where kindness comes late but stays? Don't forget to subscribe to None, Wild West Saga for more quiet stories of dignity, redemption, and late-blooming love. Because sometimes the most powerful kind of love is the kind that simply doesn't walk away.